Hey there, viewers. Picture this. You've just walked on the moon. The world's watching and everything feels historic. Until you see something you can't explain. Something no one back home would ever believe. What would you do? Today, a former Apollo astronaut just revealed what NASA has kept quiet for decades, and it's terrifying. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. He agreed to one interview. I didn't think much of the letter when it arrived. Yellowed paper, blocky handwriting, barely legible. No return address, just a name I thought I vaguely remembered from a documentary I half-watched in college. A name that didn't show up in any of the public Apollo mission archives. Not exactly the sort of thing that screams credibility. But something about it. It didn't read like a crank reaching for attention. It read like a man running out of time. I read the first few lines twice before folding it up and sliding it into my desk drawer. Forgot about it for a week. When I finally pulled it back out, it just said, "If you want to know why we never went back to the moon, come see me. No cameras, no electronics, just you." I wasn't a reporter, not in the real sense. I worked construction until last year when I messed up my knee. Been bouncing around ever since. Did a bit of online writing, mostly helping people transcribe things or ghostwrite articles they didn't want to do themselves. But this felt different. I didn't know why he picked me. I still don't. And I borrowed my cousin's truck and drove out through the Arizona desert for hours. No cell reception after a certain point. Just a gas station guy pointing toward a long cracked highway and saying, "Don't stay out there after dark. Place makes people weird." He wasn't wrong. The landscape changed the farther I drove. Dry scrubland melted into rock and dust, and the sun began to flatten the sky into a dull sheet of metal. I'd expected GPS to crap out eventually, but not all at once like it did. One second I had a map, next second blank screen. I had to pull over and double-check the handwritten directions. Look for a rusted windmill and a broken satellite dish. When I found it, it was like time peeled back 30 or 40 years. The house wasn't even a house, more like a squat, angular prefab structure half buried in dirt. Everything about it looked temporary and tired. A fence wrapped around the perimeter, mostly collapsed in places except for the gate, which was wired shut with copper. Someone had spray-painted the words "Keep Quiet" across the front in faded black letters. Not "Keep Out," "Keep Quiet." I honked once, no response. Stepped out, boots crunching against gravel and sun-baked soil. The heat clung to everything, my neck, my clothes, my teeth. There was a feeling in the air, like the kind you get before a dust storm rolls through. Stillness, but not peace, just everything holding its breath. The door opened before I could knock. He looked older than I imagined, skinny, hunched, with a beard that had turned from gray to yellow-white. Deep grooves in his face like something had carved him up from the inside out over decades. His eyes were still sharp, though. Not confused, not wandering, watching me like a bird of prey. "You came," he said, stepping aside. "Figured you might." Inside it smelled like copper and old books, stale coffee, dry sweat. The walls were covered in photographs, maps, engineering blueprints, star charts, none of it labeled. One wall was just pictures of the moon from different angles. Some I recognized from public archives, others I didn't. A few were too sharp, too recent to have been taken with Apollo-era cameras, and none of them were framed, just pinned, taped, or stapled straight into the drywall, like he didn't care about aesthetics, just access. There were no clocks that ticked, only analog dials behind thick glass covers, no hum of a fridge, no flickering TV. The microwave was unplugged and turned backwards. The wall outlets were taped over. Every surface was cluttered but deliberate, like he knew exactly where everything was but didn't want anyone else to understand the system. "Sit," he said, pointing to a chair. It had wires running from the legs into the floor. "Is this bugged?" I asked. He laughed once, short and dry. "No, but you are. So you'll sit there." I did. He pulled up another chair and placed a spiral-bound notebook in front of me. A pencil, sharpened freshly. No electronics, no recorders. "You write." "I'm not really a journalist," I said finally. "I mean, I do a little freelancing, but I'm not." "I know. That's why I picked you." I hesitated. "Why now?" He leaned back, hands folded over his stomach. "Because I don't think they're watching anymore. And if they are, it doesn't matter. They can't stop it now." He looked up at the ceiling like he was expecting it to shift or whisper or fall in on him. Then he started. "I was 29 when I walked on the moon. Not in the missions you read about. Those were distractions, smokescreens. We had to show the world something to make them stop asking the real questions." I tried to interrupt, ask him if he meant Apollo 17 or... "No," he said, "not 17, 19. He said it like a curse, like the number itself had teeth. That mission was black, buried. Most of the people who worked on it didn't even know it was real. But we launched. I stood on the far side, the side you never see, the side no one was meant to touch. My hand was already writing, even though I didn't know what to believe yet. "There's a place out there," he continued. "Not a crater, not a hill, something else, something wrong. It doesn't show up on scans, doesn't cast the right shadows. And when we landed nearby, our instruments started acting up. Radiation spikes, static, clocks desynchronized. Things that make sense if you're looking at solar interference. Things that make less sense when they happen underground." His voice was steady, but his fingers were twitching on the arm of the chair, tapping out some rhythm I couldn't place. I asked him what they found. "You don't find it," he said. "It finds you." He stood suddenly and walked over to one of the maps, an aerial photo of a jagged formation, almost circular, taken from orbit. He ran his finger along the edge. "We thought it was a sinkhole, maybe a lava tube. We were wrong. It was a lock." I didn't know what to say. The desert heat made the air feel thick inside, like the place was trapping breath. He turned back toward me, eyes darker now, sharper. "You'll want to laugh. You'll want to run. But you'll also understand why we've never gone back." I looked down at my notepad. I'd been drawing something without realizing it, a spiral, tight and jagged, almost like a fingerprint, but not quite. I didn't remember starting it. Before I could ask him more, he walked to the door and opened it. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "That's enough for one day." I stood, unsure of whether to argue. "That's it? That's all you're giving me?" He stared out at the desert. "I have to say it in order. That's the only way it holds together. Otherwise, it slips." As I stepped outside, he paused, still looking at the horizon. He wasn't supposed to wake up. The door closed behind me. And just like that, I was alone again in the dust and heat, the wind beginning to rise, like the breath of something turning over underground. Chapter 2. I walked where no one was meant to go. I never thought I'd talk about any of this again, much less to a stranger, but something about saying it out loud makes it more real, more grounded. When it stays in your head too long, it mutates. It stops feeling like memory and starts feeling like hallucination. That's how they get you to keep quiet, make you doubt your own mind until silence becomes the safest option. But silence's grip loosens when death starts pacing outside your door. So here it is. Apollo 19 wasn't public. You won't find a launch video. You won't find a crew photo or a mission patch. Hell, we didn't even have our names printed on our suits. No one cheered when we cleared the tower. No school kids followed our journey. We were launched in the dead hours of early morning, shrouded in fog, from a modified pad at Cape Canaveral that had been stripped of its usual ground crew. The whole thing was sanitized, quiet, surgical, and very deliberately detached from any association with the rest of the Apollo program. NASA didn't even run the briefings, not directly anyway. The mission was managed by a stitched-together task force. Some faces I recognized: engineers, life support techs, propulsion guys from Houston. But most I didn't. They wore no badges, no name tags, just gray suits, and the kind of posture that screams government, but not the kind you vote for. Department of Defense types, maybe even deeper. A few had British or Australian accents. I stopped asking after the third day. Every question that wasn't strictly procedural was answered with the same phrase: need-to-know basis. They told us the mission objective was a topographic survey of uncharted regions on the lunar far side, with a focus on subsurface resonance and vibrational analysis. Fancy language for go there, land, poke the ground, and come back. But something in their eyes didn't line up with their words. There was too much tension. Not the kind you get from launch risk or budget pressure. This was different. This was fear, disguised as protocol. My crewmates were both handpicked. They didn't come up through the same channels as the rest of us Apollo guys. First was Anders, though that wasn't his real name, just what he said to call him. He was the command module pilot. Quiet, calculated, always reading something, always running checklists, even when nothing needed checking. Never saw him smile. The other was Langford, the mission specialist, youngest of the three, bright-eyed in the way that makes you nervous because you know it won't last. He was a scientist, geophysics I think, but also had the look of a guy who'd been brought in late. He kept asking questions, not just about the mission parameters, but about the chain of command, the oddities in the flight plan, the strange readings in the environmental simulator. We'd finish a simulator run and he'd pull me aside and whisper things like, "Why are we practicing powered descent from this altitude? That's not in any Apollo playbook." I didn't have answers for him. I barely had them for myself. The Saturn rocket we used wasn't standard. From the outside, it looked like the usual configuration, but the moment you were inside, you could feel it wasn't quite the same. The guidance systems were newer, darker. The modules didn't have the usual placards or ID tags. Even the seats had been reupholstered with a synthetic material I'd never seen before. Cold to the touch, like it rejected heat. The pre-launch checks went fast. Too fast. We weren't given the traditional public countdown. No press was present. The pad lights were dimmed. Even the engineers avoided eye contact. ppm-0 came without ceremony, just a subtle voiceover comm saying, "Mark, you are go." And then we left Earth behind. The moment we cleared the upper atmosphere, I felt it. The same way you feel pressure drop before a storm. Something intangible but present. I told myself it was nerves, residual adrenaline. That lie worked for maybe the first 2 hours of translunar injection, but once we entered coasting phase and things quieted down, I noticed the silence was too complete. Normally there's a soft hum, a gentle background of systems, slight vibrations through the hull. But this time it was like the ship didn't want to be heard. Like it was listening instead. Langford started reporting slight variances in cabin pressure, not enough to trigger alerts, but just enough to register. The oxygen levels were stable, but he claimed he could taste metal in the air. I brushed it off, told him to log it and move on. Anders said nothing. He hadn't said much since launch, just stared out the tiny porthole at the empty black, adjusting trim values that didn't need adjusting. The Earth shrank behind us. The moon loomed closer. We performed the standard lunar orbit insertion, though the trajectory we followed dipped lower than any I'd ever trained for. We skimmed the edge of the dark side, tracing a path toward a region that wasn't labeled on any mission maps. We weren't aiming for a mare or a highland. We were going for a deep depression nestled between two heavily eroded craters, an area that looked almost like a scar, a perfect oval, nearly symmetrical. Too clean to be natural, but too rough to be artificial. It had no name, just a grid coordinate and a caution tag. Blackout zone. When we descended into it, the instruments began misbehaving almost immediately. Our altimeter flickered, the radar pinged, Inconsistent terrain returns. The onboard compass, which shouldn't have been sensitive to lunar magnetism at all, began drifting. I could feel a soft vibration through the hull. It didn't come from the engines. It was like the whole landscape below us was humming. Langford was at the window, trying to capture visual readings. He whispered something under his breath, something I didn't catch. I asked him to repeat it. He didn't, just stared harder, knuckles white around the edge of the frame. Langford remained silent, hands steady on controls, face pale in the low light. The descent profile was smooth, but the terrain didn't look right. It wasn't the rough, jagged landscape we were trained for. This place was almost flat, flattened, polished in sections. We passed over formations that looked like perfect triangles embedded in the regolith, angular rises that reflected sunlight too cleanly, shadows that didn't stretch the way they should have. I blinked twice, thinking it was just fatigue, but the shapes were still there, repeating, geometric wrong. Adjusting pitch 5 degrees, Anders said, voice dead flat. Landing zone verified. We touched down without a jolt. No cloud of dust, no bounce, just contact, immediate and absolute. The lander sat still, like it had been placed there by something else. No shudder, no feedback. It was the quietest landing I'd ever experienced. I looked out through the viewport and saw a horizon that didn't curve. The land ahead stretched out in a line too straight, with no variation. The surface shimmered faintly, like heat mirage, but the moon had no atmosphere to cause that. The shadows were long and hard-edged, slicing across the surface like blades. Langford said it first. This place isn't dead. I didn't know what he meant then, but I would. Because what we landed on wasn't lunar soil. Not entirely. And what waited beneath our feet wasn't rock or dust. It was something that remembered. Chapter 3. The silence beneath our feet. There was something wrong with the way sound didn't carry on the moon. I mean, we knew that. Everyone learns early on that with no atmosphere, there's no medium for sound waves to travel. And yet, after we landed, it felt louder in that silence than any engine burn or comms buzz I'd ever experienced. It was the kind of silence that pressed in against your helmet, that wrapped around your thoughts and squeezed until you weren't sure whether the noise was coming from inside your head or somewhere just beyond the edge of your suit's capability. We spent the first hour after touchdown running standard surface diagnostics, checking the lander's stability, confirming orientation, verifying systems integrity. At least, that was the goal. Almost every one of our instruments began drifting off spec almost immediately. Langford noticed it first. The environmental sensors were logging temperature variances that didn't match the lunar models. Too warm in some areas, almost frigid in others, despite uniform exposure. At first, we chalked it up to equipment drift, maybe a calibration error from descent turbulence. But then the radiation monitor started jumping erratically, not in sharp spikes, but in long, pulsing waves, like tides coming in and out from beneath us. Anders tried recalibrating, tapping the monitor, even swapping out one of the sensor arrays with a backup. The readings didn't change. They kept climbing, then dipping, climbing again, rhythmic, predictable, alive. We didn't speak about it, not directly. The suits had open comms, of course, but even breathing into the line felt heavy. There was this unspoken understanding that if you said something was wrong, then it became real, and none of us were ready to cross that threshold yet. So we kept logging, kept checking. Our internal clocks, however, started losing sync. Not just between each other, but between the suit logs and the lander's core systems. Langford mentioned it when he noticed his suit time and the mission elapsed timer were off by more than 3 minutes, even though he'd synced both less than an hour earlier. I checked mine. Same story. The lander's chronometer was ticking slower, only by milliseconds at first, then by whole seconds. Anders claimed his was accurate, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice, the tightness around the words. It wasn't until our second EVA, maybe 2.5 hours into the surface op, that we heard it, or maybe felt is the better word. We were about 70 meters from the lander, moving along a jagged slope that flanked one side of the flat basin where we'd touched down. It was a natural formation by the look of it, a crater ridge perhaps, but its edges were too linear, not perfectly straight, not obviously artificial, but intentional, like it had been eroded into shape by something with a preference for angles. I bent down to collect a regolith sample and paused. There it was, a low, pulsing thrum, faint just at the edge of sensation, more like a pressure against the soles of my boots than any actual vibration. I thought it might be the suit's circulation system, maybe a feedback loop in the oxygen flow. But then I saw Langford turn sharply, looking down at the ground as if he'd felt it too. Anders didn't speak. He stood still, helmet canted slightly, the visor catching the sun's reflection off one of the ridgeline rocks. I waited. Then Langford said the words I'd been trying to avoid. "You feel that?" We confirmed it wasn't suit malfunction. The pressure came in slow intervals, 6 seconds on, 6 off, like a pulse, deep and regular. No geological process we knew could account for it. The moon was seismically inert, especially in that region. There were no known gas pockets, no residual tectonic activity, and yet it pulsed over and over, like the whole plane was sitting on top of something immense and very much alive. Langford's readings started showing trace acoustic resonance. Again, impossible without atmosphere, but there it was, a spike every 6 seconds matching the pulse. He tried recalibrating the microphone arrays, but they registered nothing when pointed skyward. Only when angled toward the regolith did they capture the signal. It was coming from below, a sound that wasn't a sound. We continued up the slope. I don't remember making the decision to move forward, it just happened. Like momentum had taken over and our bodies followed it instinctively. The terrain shifted under our feet, not physically, but perceptually. What had looked like jagged moon rock now seemed uniform in pattern. As we climbed, we reached a notch in the ridge, barely wide enough to squeeze through in our suits, and found ourselves staring into a hollowed-out depression in the rock wall. It wasn't a cave, it wasn't natural. The entrance was a flattened oval, with beveled edges and a collapsed ceiling that formed an angular tunnel sloping inward. The walls weren't made of the same regolith. They were darker, smoother, not polished but dense and matte, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stop. But we didn't. We stepped inside. Our helmet lights illuminated about 10 meters of the passage. Beyond that, it curved downward into shadow. The walls were etched with a repeating pattern, grid-like lines intersecting at irregular intervals, almost fractal but with strange asymmetry, like something had been trying to draw mathematics without ever seeing a number. Langford reached out and touched one of the grooves with his gloved hand, and the moment he did, a ripple passed through the pattern. Not light, not motion, something subtler. The etched surface shimmered, as if recognizing contact, and a low hum began resonating through our boots again, this time faster. 5 seconds, then 4. The interior temperature dropped. The ambient readings in our suits fell by almost 15 degrees. The lights on my helmet flickered once. Anders said nothing, but I caught him glancing toward the exit. Langford was transfixed, staring at the patterns. His breathing had picked up, short and shallow over the comms. I asked if he was okay. No answer, just the sound of his breath and something else underneath it, something faint and wet and whispering. There was no air in that tunnel, no sound, and yet I swear to this day I heard voices. Indistinct, close, circling, not human, not angry either. Curious, hungry. They didn't speak in words, it was more like intention made noise. I shook my head, trying to clear it, looked at the floor, and suddenly it wasn't flat anymore. The tunnel had bent without us noticing. The angles were wrong, subtly skewed so that forward felt downward, and downward felt stretched. My legs moved slower, but not from fatigue. It was like space had thickened around us. Langford stepped farther in. He wasn't responding anymore, just walking, slow and stiff, hands trailing along the wall. I took a step after him, but Anders stopped me with one hand on my chest plate. "We go back," he said. His voice was shaking. I nodded, mouth dry. I didn't argue. We turned. Langford didn't. I had to grab him. He resisted for half a second, then blinked as if waking up from something and followed. The moment we stepped out into the light again, I felt a weight lift, physically and mentally. The silence returned, that deep moon silence that had somehow come to feel safer than the hum. The lander was still visible less than 100 meters away, but it looked farther. I can't explain it. The perspective had changed, like someone had altered the rules of distance. We started moving back, slow and careful, heads on a swivel. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. Our suits logged the walk back as 15 minutes. My internal sense of it was double that, maybe more. When we reached the lander, Anders climbed up first. I followed. Langford was behind me, then beside me, and then he wasn't. I turned. Empty gray, no movement, no footprints, nothing. "Langford, come in," I said. "Status check." There was a long pause, then his voice came over comms, flat and distant. "I see it now, it's awake." And then silence. Chapter 4. We brought it back. We found Langford less than an hour after he vanished. At least, his body. Whether the man inside it was still Langford, I'm not sure. He was crouched near the lander, hunched down low like a dog curled into a patch of shade. At first, we thought he was working on something, maybe calibrating one of the survey panels or reconnecting a feed. But as we got closer, we saw it was the ground he was focused on. With one gloved finger, he had drawn out an elaborate spiral into the dust. Not a simple coil or circle, but a fractal. Delicate, precise, extending itself outward in repeating loops that overlapped and interwove in a pattern I didn't recognize but couldn't look away from. He didn't react when we approached, didn't respond when we called his name. His face, visible through the visor, was expressionless, still, like he wasn't seeing us at all, like he was seeing something else entirely, and that something was more real to him than we were. Anders tried to talk to him, kneeled beside him, touched his shoulder, and asked him if he was hurt. Langford blinked once, then again. His lips moved, but no words came out, just a faint huff of breath, a twitch of the jaw. After a moment, he whispered something none of us could understand. Not English, not anything. The suit comms picked it up, but even when I played the recording back later, it sounded muffled, fragmented. Like speech run backward through static. Anders kept trying, but I stayed still. Something about Langford's eyes didn't sit right with me. Not wide with panic or narrow with anger, just flat, dull, like he was a mile beneath himself, floating somewhere deep under his skin. We got him back into the lander. We had to practically lift him. He didn't resist, but he didn't help either. He just moved like a puppet. We checked his vitals. Everything read normal, heart rate, oxygen, blood pressure, but he wasn't there. He sat strapped into the seat across from me, head angled slightly to the side, like he was trying to repeat something to himself or suppress something that wanted out. At one point, I think he started crying, but it was hard to tell through the suit. The only thing he said clearly the whole ride home, really clearly, was a sentence he whispered. Just as we broke lunar orbit, it's inside the stone. That was all. Then nothing. We splashed down 3 days later. No ticker tape, no press, no celebration. A recovery vessel met us, different from the standard Navy carrier groups used for Apollo retrievals. This ship had no markings. The crew didn't wear uniforms, just clean suits and mirrored goggles. We weren't taken to Houston or Cape Canaveral or any known NASA medical facility. Instead, we were flown to a location they refused to name and put through decontamination protocols that didn't match anything I'd ever seen before. Quarantine wasn't about germs or pathogens. It wasn't about safeguarding Earth. It was about control, containment. They split us up immediately. Langford was wheeled away before we even disembarked. I didn't see Anders again either, not after the initial medical checks. My room had no windows, no clocks, and a single camera that blinked slowly in the corner, red when I was awake, green when I slept. They monitored everything: blood work, neurological scans, cognitive assessments, daily debriefings with men who never gave names and never responded to mine. They didn't ask what we found on the moon. They asked how it made us feel. They asked about dreams, about time, about whether we heard anything when we touched the surface, whether we felt a presence, whether we saw structures that seemed to observe rather than exist. The strangest part was how cautious they were. They weren't curious. They were afraid. The kind of fear that's already accepted something, but refuses to acknowledge it aloud. Like they knew we were contaminated. Not physically, but conceptually. That something had gotten into us. Not a parasite, not a signal, but a pattern, an idea. And that if we described it clearly enough, it might spread. I was released after 21 days. No reason given. Just a man in a pale blue suit telling me my vitals were stable and that I'd been cleared for reassignment. I declined, took my discharge, vanished into civilian life, though I never really re-entered it. I didn't contact my family, didn't return to any of my pre-mission circles. I rented a small place outside Flagstaff and pretended to be nobody. But even in isolation, it followed me. It started small. Electrical devices behaving oddly. My toaster would jam, then operate fine when unplugged. My watch would reset itself to 0 every morning. Then came the lights, flashing in Morse-like rhythms that I couldn't decode but felt familiar. Then came the visions. At first they were dreams, glimpses of the tunnel, of Langford's spiral in the dust, of a long corridor that bent inward on itself like an origami fold made from stone. Then the dreams began spilling into waking life. I'd be brushing my teeth and see a flicker in the mirror, just for a second, but unmistakable. A silhouette at the edge of perception, a reflection of a tunnel where no tunnel should be. The mirror would cloud over, and for a moment, I'd be back there, on that ridge, hearing that pulse beneath my boots. And then there was the language. I don't speak any other languages, never did. But I'd wake up some nights whispering to myself, long strings of sounds that didn't belong to anything I knew, but carried a weight that went straight through the center of me. Guttural vowels, clicking consonants, like my mouth remembered something my brain wasn't allowed to. I started recording myself at night, audio only. I didn't dare use a camera. On the third night I heard it clearly, the same word repeated 5 times, at 3:33 a.m. Kulturish. I still don't know what it means. I don't want to. That was the moment I knew we hadn't left it behind. We'd brought it back. Not in our suits or our boots or the regolith samples they never let us keep, but in our minds, in the shape of our thoughts, in the resonance of memory. Langford never surfaced again. Anders did, briefly. I saw him in a photograph 10 years after the mission. He was attending a private aerospace conference, unannounced, unnamed. He looked hollow, like his skin was just the memory of flesh. I tried to reach out through back channels. Got a single reply. Not safe. They're still listening. So I stopped reaching. I thought for a time I could live with it, that it might fade, but it didn't. It just changed tactics, grew quieter, more patient. I began to notice patterns in the world around me. Traffic lights blinking in trios, birds arranging themselves into spirals overhead, cracks in the wall forming triangles too perfect to be accidents. I couldn't ignore them anymore. Which brings me to you. I know they'll erase this interview. I know they'll find a way to scrub whatever you publish or archive or transmit. But the shape will remain. You'll remember the cadence, if not the words. You'll draw the spiral in your notes without meaning to. It's already begun, hasn't it? You dream of the ridge, of the tunnel, of the thing beneath it breathing in slow pulses. And you don't know why. But you will. Because it's not finished with us. Not yet. And you've heard it now. And somewhere beneath all this dust and distance, it's listening again. Chapter 5. We Were Never Alone. He took me down into the basement just after sunset. No lights on the stairs, no switch at the top. Just a flashlight with a flickering beam that painted everything in shaky, shifting gold as we descended. The air was cooler down there, dense with something unspoken, like it had been waiting for years for someone to come and ask the right questions. The wood creaked under my boots, and for a moment I thought about how stupid it was, how reckless it was, to be alone in the dark with a man who had already admitted to hiding classified artifacts, to smuggling something out of a lunar mission that never officially existed. But I kept following him. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something deeper. Something drawn to the rhythm of his words, the way he told the story like it was already happening again. The flashlight stopped on a crate in the far corner of the room. Metal, gray, locked with a set of old mechanical clasps. No electronics, no digital keys, no signs of aging beyond the thin layer of dust that didn't quite settle evenly across the top. He knelt beside it without speaking, wiped his hand across the lid once, then opened it. Inside was the impossible. I didn't know what I was looking at, not really, but even a layman like me could tell it didn't belong here. The first piece was a shard of something metallic, though metal feels inadequate to describe it. It was dark gray, almost black, but shimmered with a faint blue sheen when the light hit it at an angle. Its edges weren't sharp in the conventional sense. They felt like they sliced reality more than matter. I didn't touch it, but I could feel a kind of pressure coming off of it, like it had its own presence, like it was watching. The second object was worse. A slab, rectangular, maybe the size of a large book, smooth on one side and etched on the other with grooves so fine and intricate they seemed to shift when I blinked. My eyes couldn't hold on to it. Every time I tried to focus, the lines would realign themselves. Not obviously, not like they were moving, but like they were adapting to the way I was perceiving them. I felt dizzy just standing near it. He said nothing for a while, just let me look. Then he spoke. "We found the structure beneath the surface," he said, voice lower than before. It wasn't buried by time, it was embedded, fused into the crust, like the moon grew around it. I asked what it was. "An interface," he said, "or a lock, or a warning. We couldn't tell." I kept my eyes on the slab. "And this?" He hesitated. "We think it's a recording device, a kind of data archive, but it's not made for us. It doesn't operate on any logic we understand. The engineers who studied it said it responded to presence, not touch, not power, not heat, just awareness." He went quiet for a moment, then reached into the crate and pulled out a sheet of paper. Handwritten notes, faded and cramped, diagrams, sketches, equations I couldn't begin to understand. "The others started dying a few years after the mission," he said. "Not officially, of course. Some had strokes, others developed cancers. A few just disappeared. One of them drove out into the Mojave and never came back. Found his truck a week later. No body, just a hole in the sand the size of a man, perfectly circular." I swallowed hard, then asked what happened to the rest. They stopped talking. Every one of them, even Anders. He called me once in the middle of the night, just breathing on the line for nearly 2 minutes before he finally whispered, "It's still spinning." Then he hung up. I never heard from him again. I asked what he meant by spinning. He opened a drawer behind the crate and pulled out a sketchbook. Inside were dozens of pages, each one filled with the same image, variations of a single object, a cube suspended in darkness, rotating slowly above a bed of jagged black soil. Sometimes it had lines radiating from it like tendrils. Sometimes it was wrapped in concentric rings that bent around it like waves. But always the cube, always turning, always present. They saw it in their dreams, he said, over and over, and not just in sleep, in reflections, in static, in the silence between breaths. I asked if he saw it too. He didn't answer, just stared at me for a long time, eyes glinting under the dim light, until I looked away. Then he said the words I'll never forget. We weren't the first. We were just the first to survive it. The flashlight flickered again, and for a second I thought it would die entirely. When the light came back steady, he was standing. "You think the moon is a rock?" he said. "A dead world. It's not. It never was. It's a shell, a skin, maybe a device, maybe a tomb, maybe something else, but it's not what they told us it was." I asked him what he meant by they. He laughed, a low, bitter sound. "NASA. The government. Sure, in the beginning, but after a while it didn't matter. The knowledge was the contagion. Once you understood, once you saw, you were infected. It's not a matter of secrecy, it's survival. We're not protecting the public from the truth, we're protecting the truth from the public." I didn't understand, not fully, but I was starting to feel it, the edges of it, that pressure in the air again, like something vast and silent was listening from just beneath the surface of everything, like I had stepped too close to a frequency that didn't want to be heard, and now it was adjusting to me. He replaced the artifacts in the crate and closed it, sealing the clasps with a practiced motion. Then he looked at me and said, "You've seen it now. It's already started." I tried to protest, to ask what he meant, but the words died in my throat. Because in that moment I remembered something. A dream I'd had the night before, one I couldn't recall until now. In it I was standing on a plain of black dust under a skyless void. And in front of me, rotating in slow, silent revolutions, was a cube. Its surface reflected nothing. Its corners were sharper than physics should allow, and beneath it, the ground was alive with a soft, rhythmic pulse, like breath. Like waiting. I hadn't told anyone. I dismissed it as stress, as the result of listening to too many old space stories. But now I knew better. I had brought it with me, or it had brought me here. And deep below, something ancient was watching, not with eyes, with memory. We were never alone. Chapter 6. The signal never stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I tried, but the moment my eyes closed, my body would jerk awake like it had forgotten how to breathe. The air in my rented motel room had gone stale, the kind of oppressive stillness that feels engineered rather than natural. I kept the lights on and my laptop open, the screen dimmed to a dull glow as I stared at the blinking cursor, the notepad filled with fragments of a story that didn't want to be told. I'd written down everything the old man had said, every word, every phrase, every bizarre and chilling revelation. I had the details, but that wasn't enough. It didn't feel real, not yet. I needed proof, something I could point to, something verifiable, something that hadn't been pulled from the corners of a fractured mind. The next morning I drove into the nearest town, found a coffee shop with half-decent Wi-Fi, and set up shop at a corner table. I didn't even bother to check the news or open my inbox. I went straight to the mission logs, official NASA records, archives, PDFs of declassified documents. I combed through everything from Apollo 17 onward. 17, officially, was the last crewed mission. 18 had been proposed but cut. 19 and 20 were supposedly canceled due to budget constraints. That was the official story. And yet, the gaps didn't sit right. There were launch-paid maintenance reports dated after 17's return. There were requisition forms for lunar module components, sensor arrays, radiation shielding, all dated 1973. Some even marked as non-attributed cargo. What the hell did that mean? I found a forum buried in the darker corners of the internet. a thread from 2007 titled "Where Did Apollo 19 Really Go?" Most of the replies were unhinged conspiracy nonsense. Alien bases, reptilian astronauts, secret moon wars, but a few posts stood out. One mentioned anomalous seismograph data from the far side of the moon, recorded in mid-1973 by a passive listening station mounted during Apollo 12. Another hinted at a brief transmission from a spacecraft never named in any public documentation, intercepted by a civilian ham radio operator who later recanted his story before vanishing from public life. I tried tracing IPs, usernames, anything that could lend a shred of legitimacy to the claims. Every thread led to dead ends, deleted accounts, server errors. But I kept digging. I contacted a retired NASA technician I'd found through an old alumni directory, a man named Harold Feldman who had worked in telemetry analysis during the Apollo years. I told him I was writing a piece on decommissioned lunar seismic arrays and was curious if he'd ever encountered any anomalies during his time. I expected a polite decline. Instead, he asked if I could talk on the phone. "No emails," he said. Harold's voice trembled when he spoke, like the weight of memory was pressing down on his lungs. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask who I was affiliated with. He just launched into it, like he'd been waiting years for someone to ask. "There was a signal," he said. "Started right after 17 returned. We logged it as a seismic echo at first. Low frequency, regular interval, not tied to any known impact or event, but it kept coming, every 27 days, right on schedule. Same strength, same frequency, like clockwork. We called it the heartbeat." I asked what they thought it was. "Nothing natural," he said, "and it wasn't coming from the crust. It was deeper, much deeper. We weren't supposed to talk about it. Orders came from higher up, way above our pay grade. They told us to scrub the logs, flag them as corrupted." He paused for a moment, then added, "But I didn't delete everything. I kept some of the tapes. Not all of them, but enough to prove it was real." I asked him if I could see them. He said no. He said they weren't safe, that even keeping them in his house made him sick. He'd buried them out in the desert, somewhere only he knew, and even then he wasn't sure it had been enough. I tried to press, but he ended the call. Wouldn't answer again. That same night, I pulled up an old report on Artemis program testing. Buried in a dense technical document was a footnote about unexplained sensor data collected during a dry run for the Gateway Lunar Orbital Platform. A spike in gravitational wave noise near a specific coordinate on the far side, almost identical to the one I'd seen in the Apollo documents, and in a separate interview with an unnamed Artemis astronaut in training, the pilot described a recurring dream about being buried under the lunar surface, unable to scream, with a faint humming surrounding him like a living machine breathing through stone. It was all aligning, the same patterns, the same whispers, different decades, different missions, same location. When I returned to the astronaut's compound the following day, I found him on the floor. He was conscious but unresponsive, his body convulsing in short bursts like tremors passing through the earth of his own flesh. I called for help, what help I could muster out there in the middle of nowhere, and a volunteer paramedic arrived an hour later. They ran his vitals, stable but strange. Heart rate slow, almost sedate. Blood pressure normal, but when they took samples and ran a preliminary scan with a portable radiation counter, the device went haywire, spiked up, red-lined, then flat-lined. When I asked if the machine was broken, the medics shook their head. "This reading doesn't make sense. If he was exposed to this kind of radiation, his body should be in shock, or worse." But he wasn't. He just laid there, twitching, eyes half-lidded, mouth forming shapes with no sound. I leaned in close once and swore I heard that same word he mentioned before. "Call Teresh." When they loaded him into the ambulance, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not worry, not fear for him, It was more selfish than that, like something valuable was being taken away, or like something else had just been let loose. I packed my things that evening, folded my notes into a manila envelope and placed them on the passenger seat. My GPS booted up fine as I left the driveway, the screen lighting up with that familiar green arrow. I hadn't driven more than 5 miles when the signal dropped. Not gradually. One moment it was there, the next static. The route vanished. Then the phone powered itself off. I didn't touch it. Moments later, the speakers clicked. I hadn't paired the phone, hadn't synced any audio, and yet, from the car's sound system, his voice poured through, slow, ragged, like breath being scraped across stone. Not just from the interview. These were things I'd never heard him say aloud, things I hadn't written down. Do you hear it now? Do you feel the shape of it? It's beneath everything, always has been. The voice looped once, then twice, then silence. The road around me seemed unfamiliar, even though I knew it should be straight and flat for another 20 miles. The stars above looked too sharp, like someone had redrawn them slightly askew. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, eyes darting to the horizon. And then I knew. It was with me now. I wasn't carrying a story anymore. I was carrying a frequency, a resonance, a piece of whatever had been buried under lunar dust for 1 billion years or more. I pulled off the road and sat there in the dark, headlights cutting a tunnel through the dust ahead. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I was afraid of what might be sitting there. Or not sitting at all, just existing, waiting, listening. I thought of Feldman's voice, cracking with age and fear. The signal had never stopped. It hadn't changed. It had just spread. Not through waves, not through wires, but through people, minds tuned like antennas, drawing down echoes of something we were never meant to hear. Something deeper than stone, older than the moon, not an entity, not a being, a pattern, a purpose. And now that I'd heard it, it would never unheed me. Chapter 7. They told us to stop. There was something in his eyes that night, something that hadn't been there before. He was pale, thinner, and his skin looked like it had been pulled too tightly over a frame that no longer belonged to a man entirely of this earth. When he opened the door, he didn't speak, gestured for me to come in with a weak wave of the hand, then slowly retreated into the dim living room where the walls still pulsed with maps and photographs that no longer felt like paper, but like windows into something watching back. The air inside the house had changed, heavier now, more still, like even the dust motes were holding their breath. He sat down on the same threadbare armchair he always did, and I lowered myself across from him without saying anything. I didn't need to. His breathing was ragged, and his hands shook as he poured water into a glass he wouldn't end up drinking. There was a silence between us that stretched and settled like an old ritual finally nearing its end. When he did finally speak, it was in that broken, half-grasped tone I'd come to recognize not as weakness, but resistance. Resistance to something that had been trying to claw its way out of him for decades. It wasn't just a tunnel, he said. It wasn't just a cave or a chamber. It was a room, a place meant to be found, but not entered. His fingers twitched and flexed, ghosting movements like he was drawing something in the air. I leaned forward, listening. He spoke slowly, like every word had to be filtered through layers of memory and pain. There were walls, but they weren't made of stone. They were conceptual, boundaries shaped by perception. We didn't see them at first. We walked into the space thinking it was physical, but the deeper we went, the less that word meant anything. It bent around us, not in shape, but in comprehension. Things looked different depending on who was watching. Langford described an atrium. I saw something more like a sphere filled with fractured light. Anders never spoke about it at all. He paused, coughing once, his breath catching like something deeper had been dislodged in the telling. We weren't supposed to be there. I don't mean that in a territorial sense. I mean it in the way a virus isn't supposed to be inside a locked cell. We triggered something. Not an alarm, not a defense system, a recognition. It saw us. He closed his eyes, and for a long moment he looked like he might not reopen them. But he did, and when he did, they were wet, red. Like the telling of this part scraped something raw in him. I don't know if it's alive, not the way we are, but it thinks, it remembers, maybe not in words, maybe not in emotion, but it has purpose. The structure, whatever it is, was left there by something. Or maybe it is the thing. Maybe the moon was built around it. Maybe it seated itself in the rock and waited. I don't know. I try not to know. But when we reached the center, it communicated. He looked at me, and something in his expression shifted. Fear, shame, reverence. Not words, he said, not images either. It bypassed language entirely, straight into our minds, shapes, concepts, entire volumes of thought compressed into seconds, like being drowned in someone else's memories. But the someone wasn't human, and the memories weren't history, they were warnings. He broke then. His body shook and his hands covered his face, and I sat there not knowing whether to reach for him or to run. When he finally composed himself again, it was like watching a man stitched together from fragments. He wasn't whole anymore. I saw civilizations, he whispered. I saw entire star systems turn to ash, not by war, not by malice, just inevitability. Growth unchecked, curiosity without boundaries. Something out there tried to stop it. Maybe this structure, maybe others. A failsafe, a gatekeeper. He looked away then, staring toward the window though the curtains were drawn. It showed us what would happen if we continued, not out of cruelty, not as a threat, but as a fact, cause and effect. Open the vault, release the contents, not because we're hated, because we're loved, loved enough to be warned. He stood slowly, painfully, and walked toward the cabinet where the crate was hidden. He didn't open it this time. He just laid a hand on the top. Langford didn't go insane, he said. He was shown too much too fast. The human mind isn't built for that kind of data. It corrupted him. Not like a virus, like a fire. It lit up every part of his consciousness that hadn't yet realized how small we are. I asked him what exactly the message had said, what, if anything, had been clear. He took a long, shuddering breath and said the line that will never leave me. It looked at me, and it forgave me, but it said, "Never again." That was when I knew he was done, not just with the story, but with life. The telling had cost him something he'd been guarding for years. His hands dropped to his sides, his shoulders slumped, his body sagged like a structure relieved of its load. I helped him back to the chair. He didn't speak again. He died that night. No struggle, no panic, just a final exhale as though he'd completed something. I called the local authorities who took him away without question. No autopsy, no delay, no complications. It was as if someone had been waiting for the call, ready to move quietly and efficiently. There was no mention of the artifacts, no inspection of the property. I watched them leave, and then I left too. The drive home was longer than I remembered. The roads twisted strangely, landmarks shifted. I kept the radio off. I didn't want to hear his voice bleeding through the static again. I didn't want to remember the words, but I did, over and over. Never again. I uploaded the story a week later, redacted, anonymized, framed as fiction, a first-person narrative labeled speculative. It got a few hits, some comments, a thread on a paranormal message board that quickly derailed into arguments about aliens and government mind control. No one took it seriously, not really. Not the way it should have been taken. And yet I still check the analytics every day. And every day I see one location in particular repeatedly accessing the file. Langley, Virginia. I wonder if they know that I know. But then again, maybe they want me to. Maybe knowing is part of the containment. Maybe that's how it spreads. Just enough to inoculate, never enough to mobilize. The moon is still up there, watching, waiting. We were told to stop. And someday someone won't listen. And when they go too far, it won't forgive them. Not again. Chapter 8. It's awake again. It didn't come right away. After the funeral, if you could even call it that, there was silence. Not just the kind you hear when a house empties out or the desert holds its breath, but a deeper stillness, as if whatever he had kept in check with his silence had followed him into the grave and was trying to decide whether it wanted to come back out. I left Arizona the next morning with the envelope of notes tucked under my seat, the redacted article already published, already sinking like a stone into the endless sea of digital noise. I thought it might give me closure. I thought, maybe naively, that speaking it into existence, even in a coded, fictionalized form, would loosen the grip it had on me. For a while, I convinced myself it had. I turned my phone off. I left the devices unplugged. I stayed away from the mirrors, and it was quiet. For a while. 2 weeks passed before I received the encrypted message. No sender, no traceable domain, just a notification blinking on my laptop, an ancient laptop I hadn't used in years, air-gapped from the web, pulled out only for drafting and safe storage. It was offline when the message appeared. It should have been impossible. I clicked it without thinking, and a text file opened on its own. Lunar seismic activity resumed. Coordinates match 19.212 DEGN 30.771 DEGE. Unconfirmed thermal spike. Unconfirmed gravity flux. This is not normal. Artemis 3 launch window re-evaluated. Mission status. Indefinite delay. There's more. A link to raw data logs, waveforms, timestamps, seismographs showing sudden tremors under Mare Tranquillitatis, subtle, low-frequency movements, almost symmetrical in pattern, like something trying to breathe under the weight of kilometers of stone. Not an impact, not a collapse, something coordinated, repeating, alive. The signal matched the pulse described by Feldman, 6 seconds on, 6 seconds off, perfectly timed. It had begun again, more intense than before, spreading across a wider radius, as if the source was expanding, or waking from a long, cold sleep. I shut the laptop and sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the blank screen, at my own reflection faintly etched in the black. My face didn't look like mine anymore. There was something thinner in my eyes, something eroded and frayed, like the boundary between what I knew and what I feared was finally dissolving. It wasn't just the information, it was the memory, the way my dreams had begun to change again. The first was subtle. I stood at the edge of a field, nothing but moonlight and shadow, and in the distance, a shape hung in the sky. It wasn't a full moon, not the soft silver plate we see from Earth. It was bigger, closer, almost pressing down into the atmosphere like it had drifted just a little too close, and we hadn't noticed until it was too late. It pulsed, gently, like a lung inhaling. I could hear it, not with my ears, but with the core of me, a resonance, a frequency. It wasn't a message, it was a presence, and it was looking. The second dream was worse. I was underground, no suit, no air, still breathing. The tunnel from the Astronaut story stretched before me, endless and geometric, its walls lined with shifting glyphs that burned with cold light. I walked for what felt like days. I didn't age. I didn't starve. The laws didn't apply. Eventually, I reached a chamber, spherical, echoing, familiar, and in the center of it, suspended above black soil, was the cube, turning, watching, remembering. I woke up gasping, my bed soaked through, the walls of my room etched with scratch marks I couldn't explain, spiraling lines and triangles that seemed to shimmer when I looked too long. I scrubbed them clean. The next night, they returned. That morning, I checked the analytics on the article again. Still low traffic, still flagged by a few bots for potential conspiracy content, still ignored by the people it might matter to most, except for one persistent IP. Same region, same access pattern. Someone at NASA was still reading it, or something close enough to NASA that it knew what to look for, but not how to speak of it publicly. I reached out to a contact inside the Artemis 3 program, someone I'd spoken to before during an unrelated project. He wouldn't say much, but what he did say chilled me more than anything else. There was a temperature shift, he said. The regolith started retaining heat in patterns we've never seen before. Linear formations, narrow bands of warmth that crisscross the landing zone, like something's under the surface that wasn't there before. Or maybe it always was. Maybe it's moving. I asked why that wasn't public, why no one had sounded the alarm. He paused for a long moment, then said, "Because it doesn't fit. It doesn't match any geological model. So, they're rewriting the model instead." He hung up. I haven't been able to reach him since. The emails I sent to others inside the program bounced back. One was returned with a line of corrupted code, where the body text should have been. ASCII characters arranged in a spiraling pattern that matched the one Langford drew into the lunar dust all those years ago. At night, I started hearing it in static again, on my TV, my radio, even in white noise apps that shouldn't broadcast anything but generated sounds. A low hum, repeating, and beneath it a voice. Mine, repeating words I'd never said aloud, languages I didn't know, the cadence familiar, the tone identical to the astronaut's during his final days. I hadn't recorded myself, but the devices had. One night, I smashed them all, the laptop, the phone, every piece of electronics I owned, but it didn't matter. The dreams kept coming, and outside the moon kept growing larger. Not literally, not yet, but perceptually. It loomed, it stared, it forgave. I began to wonder if that was part of it too, the forgiveness, the warning. Maybe we were never meant to go back, not because we weren't ready, but because we were already known and tolerated. A curiosity kept at arm's length. But now we had returned, we had touched the lock again. Tapped at its edges, dared to twist the mechanisms left in stasis. And the moon had remembered. That was the last line in my final journal entry. I haven't written anything since. This will be the last. Because I saw something last night. The moon was full, low in the sky, but it wasn't where it should have been. It hovered just a degree or two off from its usual arc, not enough for most to notice, but enough for those of us who'd been marked. It pulsed once. The air around me bent just slightly. The trees tilted the wrong way, the shadows lengthened without movement. And I knew, it's awake again.